InvestorIdeas.com podcast.
Good afternoon and welcome to another InvestorIdeas.com podcast looking at cannabis news, stocks to watch, as well as insights from thought leaders and experts. Today we'll be talking to Kyle Kinglsey MD CEO and founder of Vireo Health Incorporated, trading on the CSE as VREO and the OTC as VREOF, a physician-founded multi-state cannabis company. Kyle was inspired to create Vireo after serving on the front lines of the opioid epidemic in emergency rooms across Minnesota and seeing the positive impact for medical cannabis patients. After winning one of only 2 vertical licenses issued by the state of Minnesota, the company has gone on to expand its businesses across multiple states, focusing its efforts on limited license medical states. Vireo Health International recently announced that it's expanding into New Mexico through the acquisition of the entity that manages the Red Barn, a holder of a medical cannabis license in New Mexico. In today's interview, we will be discussing the shrinking divide between the standardized medical community and the medicinal cannabis community, as well as the future of cannabis.
So today I'm here with Kyle Kinglsey, who's the CEO and founder of Vireo Health International. Kyle, thank you for being on here with me. And if you could just tell me a little bit about sort of how you started Vireo. I know you guys are one of the few physician-started cannabis companies in the U.S. So if you could talk about maybe how you came into this business and how Vireo started.
Absolutely, Taylor. Thank you for having me. I'm board certified in emergency medicine, and if you had told me, 6 years ago that I would be CEO of a large multi-state cannabis company, I would say that you are probably smoking a bit too much cannabis, because there's no reality where that would be the case. I was, the product of traditional, more conservative medical education. I was completely oblivious to the fact that there's actually, therapeutic potential with cannabis. My understanding as a medical student was just that it was a recreational substance, and a pretty benign one at that. But I really had no appreciation for the idea that there was a real possibility to treat chronic pain and other ailments with cannabinoids. And so that was an interesting gap in the kind of traditional medical education. We're working hard to fix that. But needless to say, I was at a disadvantage to many of those that were, more kind of adept and buried in the cannabis industry over the last decades. I needed some very eye-opening experiences. I can tell you the story that changed my mind. I worked emergency departments in a suburban emergency department here in Minneapolis. There was a gentleman who had been shot like a decade earlier in one of the Gulf Wars. He came in with this horrible back pain, and I was giving him significant IV opioids, IV morphine over the course of 3 nights. And the third night we got chatting at about 3 a.m. and he said, "Doc, when I was in California, I would just smoke some cannabis every day. I was on no opioids and I had very little pain." And this guy was very compelling, very believable. He wouldn't smoke in Minnesota because it was illegal. And so he's just very believable. And he was on massive doses as an outpatient of prescription opioids. As you know, 20,000 plus people in the U.S. die each year from prescription opioid overdoses. And so that was pretty compelling. I ended up touring multiple facilities in California and Colorado. And Minnesota came up with this sort of restrictive, very medically focused law. And kind of everything came together. I knew the right people. I was very excited about fighting the war on opioids. And that's kind of the start of Vireo Health.
So I guess I'd like to get into that founding story right away, because that's something that's almost become commonplace in the cannabis industry. If you really pay attention to a lot of the things that medical professionals or people who maybe didn't have a background in cannabis that have now come into the industry, they all say the same thing, which is they've had a story like that where they've seen someone get the benefits of cannabis and it's made them sort of open up to the idea of medicinal cannabis, which, as you stated, isn't really thought of in traditional medicine. I know a big thing that Vireo you focus on is working with medical practitioners. How difficult is it to try and actually get these physicians or medical practitioners to really understand the benefit of cannabis as a medicine, especially over opioids? And is that education element, are people more on board with this now, or is there still a lot of resistance to this type of thinking?
Yeah, great question. So 5 years ago when I jumped into this space, I was alone. There are very few physicians, healthcare professionals in the space at that time. Not only that, but it was exceedingly difficult to have a conversation with healthcare providers kind of in, quote unquote, mainstream medicine. It's been very pleasant to see that evolution over time. And a major focus for us in every state where we operate, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, is direct physician and healthcare provider engagement. So we actually have 4 full-time physicians on our team, led by Dr. Stephen Dahmer, who's our chief medical officer based in New York. And he leads what we call medical science liaisons in each state that interact not only with the healthcare providers, but their clinical staff. And we believe that educating them is really key. Now, physicians and medicine as a whole is fairly conservative. You need to have the evidence to kind of gain widestream acceptance of something like cannabis. That's in the pipeline. We're working hard on research, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the interim. Many pain docs are open-minded to this. They've seen the benefits of cannabis, especially as compared to opioids. Also, integrative medicine folks and even some primary care docs are really opening their eyes and seeing cannabis's potential, particularly in the realm of chronic pain.
Is some of the issue that surrounds maybe the stigmatism that's around cannabis is that it doesn't really fit into a modern category like medicine, for instance?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It really is an accident of history that this plant is where it is. You look at smoking opium, and that's very much a recreational activity. And yet it hasn't precluded the development of a wide array of extremely problematic synthetic and powerful opioids that, yes, serve a purpose in acute pain, but obviously have caused some really horrendous societal problems. And so, I think it's an accident of history that cannabis is where it is. I don't think there's an excuse anymore for us not studying this and really bringing this to the forefront, especially with chronic pain. Before the 1930s, cannabis was used routinely for a wide array of medical conditions, as you know. So it's really, again, accident of history that we are where we are with this very benign plant.
Speaking of the accident of history, the sort of negative propaganda around cannabis would say that there are negative effects to it, or really that there can be a danger with overconsumption, but whether it's coming from physicians or people who have worked with different therapy components of the plant, there doesn't really actually seem to be negative effects. Since you've been a person who's, obviously in the medical community, you have a physician background. How does it change where this plant won't be perceived as having an actual negative connotation and be as safe or as dangerous as aspirin or Tylenol?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. I believe, based on the evidence at hand, that cannabis is much safer than either Tylenol or aspirin. I am aware of no, significant.
Those are my safest examples I can think of, because I think every household has Tylenol or aspirin or some version of those drugs in there because it's a common thing for headaches.
Yeah, so Tylenol is quite dangerous, actually. It leads to many, many deaths across the world in the United States in overdose. It causes significant liver issues, even at kind of modest doses. It's surprisingly dangerous. Same with aspirin. Aspirin is a leading cause of a lot of different health issues that can be life-threatening. As you know, it's sort of a blood thinner. So quite dangerous. Similar to all, again, it's always dangerous to say never or all.
Yes.
But cannabis is not without downsides in my mind. So I just want to express that. I don't think it's the cure-all panacea for many people. I think it's very helpful for many people. But I'm concerned about a few areas. I'm concerned about really high THC consumption in younger brains. I think that may be problematic based on the evidence that's out there. I'm not excited about 14-year-olds hammering massive amounts of THC for years on end. I think that might be misguided. But all in all, I don't think that there's something that has a safer kind of side effect profile than cannabis certainly in the chronic pain space. And just as a whole, this is a very safe substance that I'm very comfortable with. But there's always hidden downsides to things, even when they're amazing natural plants like cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I don't think anything. I mean, you can eat even too much of a vegetable and it can cause you problems.
Exactly.
Pretty safe as far as the substance you can consume and take into your body. It's pretty non-damaging long term, except for, as you say, like the developmental stage.
Yeah, we always joked as a bunch of emergency medicine physicians that if you replaced alcohol with cannabis, we'd be out of a job. because people aren't going and getting in fights after they smoke up. It's unless they're drinking alcohol, then they might. But alcohol is such a pervasive scourge, and it causes so many problems societally, from cancer to violence to social strife. It's really a problem. Doesn't seem that we're seeing that with cannabis. I'm curious what 50 and 100 years of scientific and sociological research will show us, but it's hard to imagine it's going to come even close to approaching the scourge that alcohol represents.
So I'd like to get into just a little bit more the investment side of things, since we're investor ideas. Since you're a multi-state operator, what makes current states optimal or less optimal for you in deciding where to go next, and which states are you in now, and what's sort of the reason for maybe the medical advantages or the regulations surrounding those states?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a fine twist on what you said, but I really see Vireo as the scientific leader of all the multi-state operators. And, science is a lot more expansive than just medicine. I think that bringing our kind of superior science to bear across the spectrum of medical, health and wellness, and recreational adult use is going to be meaningful. A lot of the things that make states desirable for us are the things that make it desirable from a business standpoint. We really do like the flexibility to do research. Almost every state that we're in allows that. We also like states that are well regulated. And so I get a little nervous about kind of the quote unquote Wild West from a regulatory standpoint. Trailblazers for certain, but also a lot of dysfunction on the regulatory side. And so we've been drawn to states that, yes, maybe a little bit more strict on the regulation side, but it's been more comfortable for our physicians and scientists, at least while we get started. Interested in states that have a limited number of licenses, such as New York, such as Pennsylvania, such as Minnesota. And we also like, the states that, early on we liked the more pharmaceutical delivery paths, your vaporized oils, your capsules, your topicals, your solutions. We've really evolved a lot on our perspective there. We've seen that from a socioeconomic argument standpoint, folks just aren't able to afford our products versus bud, versus plant material. And so I've become a very big supporter of plant material, ideally vaporized, but if you need to smoke it, that's okay too. Just from an economic standpoint, people need access. People need to have something other than opioids. People can go to the CVS for $6. They can get enough, OxyContin to kill a handful of people for $6. And they can't afford our medication, which is a much safer alternative. So, the argument for bud and plant material access is one that I very much support.
That's interesting, because that was actually going to be one of the questions I wanted to talk about, which is your actual products. I checked out on your guys' website, which seem very modern. Like that seems to me the next evolution of if I were to imagine what cannabis would look like in the future. That's it. It's very refined, clinical looking, but you are saying that the bud isn't going to go away, I guess, in the long term.
Yeah, you've hit it on the head. I see Vireo as the cannabis company of the future, and we really embrace the more sophisticated kind of delivery routes. We also do like whole plant extracts. Obviously, that's kind of the preference of many people, is to have the more natural, full kind of bouquet of all the different components of the cannabis plant. It seems to be tolerated much better by folks. Bud will not go away just because of the economics of making these more sophisticated products. We're never going to be a boutique bud producer. That's just not our area. There are folks in California and Colorado who are much better at that. Yeah. And we'll yield that to them. We're going to focus what we know, which is the science and kind of the more sophisticated manufacturing end of things. We have quite a few products in the pipeline that haven't been seen yet in the space, and we're excited to kind of bring that IP to bear and really redefine cannabis for the future.
So thinking of then the future of cannabis, what do you really see? Obviously, as you said, the bud element is never going to go away just because of the economic value of it. So looking for the Whole Foods version, or that higher end of sort of product that you'll see in the future, what does that look like to you? What sort of delivery methods do you see people moving towards, or maybe that gets the actual best results either for medical or recreational effects?
Obviously, this is kind of exclusive of the FDA path, which will be focused more on kind of single molecule undertakings, and we have endeavors going on there, such as imagine IV cannabinoids. Wouldn't it be marvelous if you went into the emergency department with a broken ankle? That's not marvelous, but what if instead of morphine you got IV cannabinoids in much less risk, may control pain for most people, and you can kind of forego the really dangerous IV morphine, which not intermittently causes problems for people. So, there's a lot of different paths. I think folks are going to be interested in clean, whole plant extracts, generally speaking, in state-based markets. I think we've seen that in mature markets that were, shifting away from bud, frankly, and going more towards the vaporized oils, the whole plant extracts on that side. I think that things like, vegan, halal, kosher, soft gels with a wide array of different kind of quote-unquote fillings are going to be interesting to people. Low calorie, clean, effective. I think that people are going to be they're going to be much more focused on outcomes. Right now you go for a sleep aid, you're going to get some sort of, cannabis strain to vaporize or to take orally with a gummy bear or something like that. But the products are going to get much more sophisticated moving ahead. We can barely imagine some of the things that we'll see. I imagine multi-component botanicals where, why are we just limiting ourselves to the cannabis plant when there are so many other, nutraceutical and phytopharmaceutical plant-based components out there that can be added to cannabis. There's many directions. I can talk about this for days.
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit interested in that, just because it is something I've thought about, is the sort of ancillary effects you get from the cannabis industry, specifically with plant science and agriculture, which I think has evolved leaps and bounds in the last decade due to the massive influx of money that cannabis is bringing to that research sector. Do you think that there's going to be a trickle-down effect on, for instance, the other plant molecules being utilized? We've seen that now with the CBD beverage sort of sector and the CBD industry. Everyone talks about that, and there's basically going to be a CBD product of everything, it seems, in the next couple of months. Do you think that the same thing will be had not only for cannabis, but for other sort of natural, healthy plants out there?
It's definitely our intent. We have a team that's very adept at ethnobotany, sort of the study of plants as medicine. Our chief medical officer is an ethnobotanist who's studied plants in Papua New Guinea and other places. Our chief science officer is actually an IP lawyer who's growing increasingly adept at kind of seeing what's out there in the realm of phytopharmaceuticals, plants as medicine. Our global view it would be marvelous in 20 years if Vireo Health has built a plant-based alternative to basically everything that the pharma can offer. That's pretty appealing to me. I think it's very appealing to the public too to have alternatives to these harsh pharmaceuticals.
Because you're so focused on education as well, and getting the sort of physicians on board and getting people to realize this is a product, how many setbacks are there in actually dealing with like the education community in the US versus perhaps in Canada? I know here we're starting to look at a few of the universities actually having a program for cannabis or a program for medical cannabis. So these people can be licensed operators with a specialty in cannabis. Do you see that happening in the US, and what steps do you think need to be taken to get that to happen?
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this concept of sort of a residency program for healthcare providers, pharmacists, even nurses and pharmacy technicians, we sort of have a miniature residency that these folks go through, pretty expansive training program that's been put together by our physician leadership team. So most of our dispensaries actually have pharmacists on staff every shift. And so it's very different than sort of the kind of native Western cannabis dispensary with the bud tender. We've had kind of a different approach that is very focused on that sort of professional education component. What we're trying to do now is bring the expansive knowledge set of the bud tender, fuse it with our pharmacy technicians' knowledge set that they've learned from the pharmacists and physicians. And I think you're going to end up with sort of the best outcome for all patients, whether they're there for a strictly adult use experience or if they're an elderly person dying of cancer. We're really looking to fuse those two worlds. And there's no denying the decades of knowledge and kind of hands-on experience that they have out west. And we're very excited to fuse that with sort of our medical and scientific knowledge that we have in our system.
Has the changes that have gone through with CBD and the regulations surrounding that, and I know right now, I think in April, the FDA is planning on even looking into some of the components of CBD again for regulating the more across the board. So that way, people can have CBD beverages or CBD bath bombs or whatever throughout the U.S. How much has that helped your company or your development with products now? Does that make things a little easier for you, or is it not really that relevant?
Any loosening of the kind of the regulatory apparatus is helpful, with one caveat. We're kind of sticklers for quality and safety and precision, and so we don't like it when those requirements are kind of loosened. But essentially what this has allowed us to do is we're very comfortable pushing large-scale CBD production outdoors, even in these state-based medical cannabis programs. That's what this will do. The net outcome is going to drive down costs for our patients. So all for pushing cannabinoid production outdoors, with the kind of the CBD changes, it allows that.
You've mentioned before, as well, the full plant profile, and I know that there's a lot of talk of the entourage effect. Do you think that some of the focus maybe that's on the hype around CBD is warranted? Is CBD as effective of a sort of product or component if it's not without the THC and other components in the plant? Is it just more of similar to any of the pseudo health products you would see in a Whole Foods or something, where it's often overhyped as far as the actual effectiveness or health benefits of the product?
Wow, that's a great question. So, I'm not going to make myself popular here, but just strictly looking at it as a physician, the evidence for many indications for CBD is rather sparse. I'm very comfortable that CBD plays a role with these severe seizure disorders in children, and I'm fairly confident it's going to find application in chronic pain. But frankly, I think it's going to be hard for CBD to live up to the hype. I mean, it is some real hype around CBD right now.
Yeah.
But I'm open to the hype being justified. It's going to be hard for any substance to live up to this hype. I mean, it is, it might be the most interesting molecule on the planet right now. And, you've expressed a major risk in the industry right now. There are a decent number of folks that really are just focused only on the bottom line. And, if you take a sample of a bunch of different over-the-counter CBD products that are out there right now, which we have done, there are many that don't have anywhere near the CBD that they're stating on the label. And so that's concerning. Anything that tarnishes the reputation of the industry at large is concerning to us. And I don't think that CBD having sort of middling outcomes for chronic pain and seizure disorders is going to tarnish cannabis as a whole. But I think people just, consumers and business people alike need to really look at, CBD with some healthy skepticism and, continue to do things the right way. Do your due diligence.
Is there anything that you want to include, any news or anything that's maybe related coming out with Vireo?
Yeah, very excited. We just announced our expansion into Arizona today, an acquisition there, fine organic in-ground manufacturer there, Elephant Head Farms. So very excited to grow the Vireo family. We add that to Rhode Island, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Maryland, and very excited to serve the patients of Arizona.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for talking today.
Hey, thank you, Taylor. Bye.
That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.